There's a man you have never heard of who saved your life. Not metaphorically, not in the abstract sense that history sometimes allows us to invoke when we talk about great figures from the past. I mean it literally and completely. The decisions this man made, the machine he designed, the theoretical architecture he constructed in a mind that his contemporaries could barely follow, all of it changed the outcome of the Second World War so completely that historians who have spent their entire careers studying the conflict still struggle to put a number on how many millions of lives he saved. Some say 14 million. Others say the figure is closer to 21 million. A few, working from the most expansive models, argue that without him, the war in Europe might have lasted another 2 years beyond when it actually ended, producing a death toll that none of us can fully wrap our minds around. His name was Alan Turing. And for 50 years after the war ended, he was not allowed to tell a single person what he had actually done. If you find that difficult to believe, stay with me, because what I am about to tell you is not just a story of one man's genius. It is a story of how a government that owed everything to one of its citizens turned around and destroyed that citizen in a manner so methodical and so cold that it reads, at this distance in time, like a case study in civilizational ingratitude. It is a story of secrets so enormous that they had to be buried for half a century, because revealing them would have reshaped the entire post-war world and compromised the intelligence methods that Western nations were still using in the Cold War. And it is a story of a mind so far ahead of its time that even today, standing in the full light of the 21st century with all of our technology and all of our knowledge, we are still living inside the intellectual universe that Alan Turing created. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something fundamental about what you are about to hear. This is not a story about mathematics. It is not a story about computing. It is a story about what happens when society encounters a level of intelligence it cannot understand, cannot fully control, and cannot quite bring itself to honor, and the terrible, irreversible choice that society makes in response. Alan Turing was not just a genius in the ordinary meaning of that overused word. He was a kind of genius that comes along perhaps once in a century, perhaps less, and when that kind of mind is broken by the world around it, something is lost that no apology, no memorial, no image on a banknote, and no posthumous pardon can ever fully restore. So let me take you back. Let me take you back to a Britain that no longer exists, to a world balanced on the edge of annihilation, and to a small, strange, utterly brilliant man who sat down at a wooden table with a pencil and paper and began to think his way through a problem that everyone else considered impossible. If you want to truly understand what Alan Turing was up against when he arrived at Bletchley Park in the autumn of 1939, you first have to understand what the Enigma machine was and why every serious military cryptographer in the Allied world had concluded, after careful analysis, that it was not just very difficult to break, but genuinely, mathematically, operationally unbreakable. The Enigma was not simply a clever cipher device. It was a German military's philosophical statement to the world. It was their way of announcing that they had achieved something in the realm of secure communications that lay beyond the reach of any adversary's intellect. And for a very long time, and in a very real sense, they were right. The machine itself looked, at first glance, almost like a typewriter. It sat in a wooden box. It had a keyboard with a standard German layout. It had a series of rotating wheels called rotors, typically 3 for the Army and Air Force versions, 4 for the Navy's most sensitive communications, each rotor containing a complex internal wiring that mapped each of the 26 letters of the alphabet to a different letter. In front of the rotors was a plug board called the steckerbrett, which had cables connecting pairs of letters to each other before the signal even reached the rotors. And above the keyboard was a lamp panel with 26 bulbs, 1 for each letter. When an operator pressed a key on the keyboard, the electrical signal followed an extraordinary path. It traveled through the plug board, which swapped the initial letter with its paired partner. Then it passed through the first rotor, which scrambled it again, then through the second rotor, which scrambled it again, then through the third rotor, which scrambled it once more. Then it hit a reflector at the far end, which bounced the signal back through all 3 rotors in the opposite direction, through 3 completely different wiring paths, then back through the plug board. And finally, the signal lit up one of the 26 lamps on the panel. The letter on the lamp was the encrypted equivalent of the letter the operator had pressed. The operator wrote down the encrypted letter. Then he pressed the next key. And here's a critical thing. The thing that made Enigma categorically different from every cipher system that had preceded it. As he pressed that second key, the rotors moved. The rightmost rotor advanced one position, like the odometer of a car. After it had completed a full revolution, it would carry over to advance the middle rotor. And after the middle rotor completed its revolution, it would advance the leftmost rotor. This meant that the internal wiring configuration of the machine changed with every single keystroke. Press the letter A 100 times in a row, and you would receive 100 completely different encrypted outputs. Not similar outputs. Not outputs that followed a pattern you could detect. Completely, randomly appearing different outputs. And a critical design feature. No letter could ever encrypt to itself. The letter A could never produce an A as its encrypted equivalent. This seemed like a minor detail. It would turn out to be the crack in the armor through which everything was eventually broken. Now, let me give you the mathematics of what the Allied codebreakers were facing. The standard three-rotor naval Enigma, the one whose traffic was most critical to breaking during the Battle of the Atlantic, had approximately 158 quintillion possible settings. That number, written out in full, is a 1 followed by 20 zeros. If you had an unlimited team of mathematicians working every possible setting in sequence, testing each one against a single intercepted message, and if each mathematician could test one setting per second, it would take that entire team longer than the age of the universe to check all possibilities. This was not a problem of insufficient effort. This was a problem whose solution space was so vast that brute force was not merely difficult. It was cosmologically impossible. The Germans knew this. They had done the mathematics themselves, and their cryptographers and their military commanders had reached an absolute and completely understandable conclusion. Enigma was unbreakable. Not hard, not very hard. Unbreakable. End of analysis. And because they were certain of this, their operators grew careless. They began taking shortcuts. They began reusing settings across multiple days rather than selecting truly random ones. They began sending predictable messages at predictable times. A weather report would begin with a meteorological preamble, always in the same format. A routine situation report ending a quiet day would include the standard German military phrase for nothing to report. Operators who were lazy or tired would use simple keyboard patterns for their settings, picking 3 letters that were adjacent on the keyboard, or repeating letters, or using their initials. These were exactly the kinds of human failings that would eventually give Turing and his colleagues a foothold they needed to crack a cipher that was, in pure mathematical terms, completely secure. But none of that could be exploited without someone first being willing to believe that the impossible was possible. Someone had to look at those 158 quintillion configurations and say, with genuine conviction rather than merely as a rhetorical gesture, I can beat this. I know how to make this problem tractable. I know how to reduce the universe of possibilities to something a machine can handle. And that someone was a 27-year-old man who arrived at a Victorian mansion in the Buckinghamshire countryside with a head full of ideas that the rest of the world would not catch up with for another 3 decades. Alan Turing was born on June 23, 1912 in London, the second son of Julius Matheson Turing and Ethel Sarah Stoney. His father worked for the Indian Civil Service, and both Alan and his older brother John spent much of their childhood in the care of foster families in England while their parents remained in India. This is not a minor biographical detail. Growing up without consistent parental presence in households that were kindly but not deeply invested in him, in a school environment that valued conformity and athleticism and social fluency over qualities that Alan actually possessed, left marks on his personality that were visible to everyone who knew him. He was, by every account, profoundly unusual from the very beginning. Not unusual in the sense of being difficult or unpleasant, unusual in the sense of being elsewhere. His attention was not on the things that attention was supposed to be on. While other boys were focused on cricket scores and social hierarchies and the elaborate rituals of English public school life, young Alan was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about the structure of plants, about the mathematics of growth, about the nature of computation years before the word existed in its modern sense. His teachers at Sherborne School in Dorset, which he attended from the age of 13, had genuinely no idea what to do with him. His headmaster wrote a report suggesting that it would be best if he chose to be either a scientist or a classicist, but that he could not be both. The idea that he might be something that had not yet been named did not seem to have occurred to anyone. He ran. This is one of the things his friends and colleagues later remembered most vividly. He ran enormous distances. 20 miles, 30 miles, sometimes more, through the countryside around wherever he happened to be living. He was genuinely a world-class distance runner at his peak, and after the war, he would misqualify for the 1948 British Olympic team by only a few minutes in a trial race, while simultaneously doing some of the most important work in the history of computing. The running was not just exercise. It seemed to serve some deeper function, some process of thinking or processing, or simply existing his body in a way that the rest of his life did not quite allow. He kept a stuffed bear named Porgy that he had owned since childhood, which he consulted on intellectual matters of particular difficulty. He learned to sew so that he could repair his own clothes. He chained his coffee mug to a radiator pipe at work to prevent it from being stolen, apparently considering this a perfectly reasonable security measure. He cycled to work wearing a gas mask, not out of any unusual fear of chemical warfare, but because he had hay fever and had discovered that the mask filtered pollen with considerable effectiveness. These are the details that make Alan Turing recognizable as a human being rather than a legend, and I want you to hold them in mind as we go forward, because the human being matters just as much as the achievement. By the time Turing was in his early 20s, studying mathematics at King's College, Cambridge, he was already operating at a level of originality that placed him in a completely different category from his peers, including some extraordinarily gifted peers. Cambridge mathematics in the early 1930s was one of the most intellectually concentrated environments in the world, and Turing was not merely distinguished there. He was genuinely unusual in a way that his supervisors and colleagues recognized immediately, even if they could not always articulate exactly why. In 1935, he attended a course of lectures on the foundations of mathematics given by the topologist Max Newman, who was exploring the implications of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Gödel had recently demonstrated, in a proof of breathtaking elegance and devastating consequence, that any sufficiently complex formal mathematical system contains true statements that cannot be proved within that system. This result had shaken the foundations of mathematics, and its implications were still being worked out. Newman's lectures examined a related question posed by the German mathematician David Hilbert, the Entscheidungsproblem or decision problem, which asked whether there existed a definite mechanical procedure that could determine for any mathematical statement whether that statement was provable. Turing became obsessed with this question, and in 1936, while lying in a meadow in Grantchester during a rest after a long run, he had an insight that would change human history. He imagined a machine, not any specific machine, but an abstract, theoretical machine, a conceptual device that could read symbols from an infinite tape, write new symbols, move the tape left or right, and change an internal state based on what it had read. The machine could perform any calculation that could be precisely defined. He called it, somewhat modestly, an automatic machine. We call it a Turing machine. The paper he published in 1936, on computable numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem, answered Hilbert's question by showing that no such mechanical decision procedure could exist. But the answer to Hilbert's question was almost secondary to what Turing had created in the process of reaching it. He had described, in rigorous mathematical terms, a universal computing machine, a machine that, given the right program encoded on its tape, could simulate any other Turing machine, a machine that was, in principle, capable of performing any calculation that any other machine could perform, a machine that was, in principle, capable of performing any calculation that could be defined precisely enough to constitute an algorithm. Every computer that has ever been built, from the first room-sized machines of the 1940s to the phone in your pocket, to most powerful supercomputers currently operating anywhere on Earth, is a physical implementation of the abstract architecture that Turing described in 1936 when he was 23 years old. The processor inside your phone is not just vaguely inspired by Turing's ideas. It is, in a deep and precise mathematical sense, a physical instantiation of a Turing machine. When you understand that, you begin to understand what we are talking about when we talk about the magnitude of Alan Turing's contribution to the world you actually live in. The paper was published, It was recognized immediately by the small community of logicians and mathematicians working on foundational questions as a profound contribution. Princeton's Alonzo Church, who had independently reached a related but somewhat different formulation of the same problem, wrote to Cambridge about Turing, and Turing went to Princeton for 2 years to work with him. He considered staying in America, which might have changed the course of his life considerably. He chose to return to England in 1938. He took up a part-time position with the Government Code and Cipher School, the organization responsible for British cryptography. And when war came in September 1939, he was one of the first people to report to Bletchley Park. The estate that became Britain's code-breaking headquarters was, and still is, a rather ugly Victorian mansion surrounded by a collection of temporary huts and outbuildings that were added as the operation expanded. It sat in the middle of nowhere, deliberately, far enough from London to be invisible, close enough to the railway to allow its staff to commute from across southern England. The park's grounds were damp and chilly for much of the year. The huts where the actual work was done were uninsulated and inadequately heated. The canteen was universally described as terrible. And within this thoroughly unglamorous setting, the British government assembled one of the most extraordinary collections of intellectual talent ever gathered in a single location. There were chess champions, including several who ranked among the best players in the world. There were crossword puzzle virtuosos who had been recruited through competitions run in national newspapers. The theory being that anyone who could solve the Daily Telegraph cryptic crossword in under 12 minutes might have the kind of mind useful for code-breaking. There were classicists, linguists, historians, mathematicians, and what one might generously describe as professional eccentrics. Gordon Welchman was a Cambridge mathematician who would make a contribution to the bomb's design as important as Turing's own. Hugh Alexander was the British chess champion and one of the finest natural cryptanalysts of his generation. Dilly Knox was a classic scholar turned codebreaker who had been doing this work since the First World War. Bill Tutte was a young chemist who would break the Lorenz cipher, an entirely separate German encryption system used for Hitler's high-level strategic communications, entirely from deduction and without ever seeing the machine that produced it. Peter Hilton, Jack Good, Max Newman. These were people of unusual intellectual power, and they were all there, all working on the hardest problem any of them had ever encountered. And they were getting nowhere. For the first months of the war, the Enigma traffic remained impenetrable. The Poles had helped. The brilliant cryptographers at the Bureau Cipher in Warsaw had made genuine progress against earlier versions of Enigma in the 1930s, and in a meeting in the Pyrie Forest outside Warsaw in late July 1939, just weeks before the German invasion destroyed their country, they had handed over everything they knew: their methods, their rebuilt Enigma machines, their Bomba devices, which were the ancestors of what Turing would build, and the crucial insight that systematic decryption required. Mechanical assistants. Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosicki, and Henryk Zygalski were mathematical geniuses whose contribution to the eventual Allied victory deserves recognition that is never fully received, partly because Poland was defeated so quickly and so catastrophically that his role in winning the war could not survive as easy to overlook. But the Germans had changed their procedures after the Polish breakthrough. They had added complexity to the indicator systems that told operators how the machine was set up. They had changed the number of plugboard connections. They had issued new and more restrictive operating procedures designed to prevent the kind of operator laziness that had been exploitable before. The methods Rejewski had developed were no longer working. Bletchley Park had a foundation, a crucial foundation, but the building that needed to go on top of it had not yet been designed. Turing saw what needed to be done. He saw it because his mind operated at a level of abstraction that allowed him to see past the specific mechanical details of the Enigma and perceive its underlying logical structure, the structure of the problem itself rather than the structure of any particular instance of it. What he realized and what he articulated in a theoretical framework that would then be turned into an engineering specification was this: you cannot break Enigma by searching through possible settings randomly, because there are too many of them for any brute force approach. But you can break it by exploiting contradictions. Here is the key insight. A properly implemented Enigma message contains a key used encrypted, encoded in the message header. The message was first encrypted with the day's settings to produce an indicator. Then the message text was encrypted with a subsidiary key that the indicator was designed to communicate. The operators were supposed to choose truly random keys. but in practice they often didn't. More importantly, Turing realized that if you had a piece of probable plaintext, a word or phrase that you were reasonably confident appeared somewhere in a message, you could use the relationship between that plaintext and the corresponding ciphertext to test whether a particular Enigma setting could have produced it. These probable plaintexts were called cribs, and the Germans, despite their mathematical confidence in Enigma security, were extraordinarily generous in providing cribs without knowing it. Weather stations always began their reports with the same meteorological preamble. Duty officers always ended quiet night reports with "Kein besonderen Ereignis," nothing to report. And Enigma's own design, specifically that no letter could encrypt to itself, meant that any candidate crib could be immediately eliminated from a particular position in a message if any letter of the crib would have to encrypt to itself at that position. This gave Turing a way to dramatically reduce the number of possible plaintext positions for any given crib, which in turn gave him a much smaller set of Enigma settings to test. The machine he designed to exploit this insight was the bomb. It was an engineering challenge as much as a conceptual one, and Turing was working with engineers and machinists who had to translate his abstract specifications into physical reality. The first bomb, which was called Victory, was operational at Bletchley Park by March 1940. It was enormous, roughly 2 meters high and nearly 2 meters wide, and it made a distinctive rhythmic clicking sound as its drums rotated. The sounds and smells of that machine, the oil, the heat, the mechanical percussion, became part of the sensory landscape of Bletchley for the people who worked there. The bomb worked. Not perfectly, not quickly enough in those early days, and not on every type of Enigma traffic, but it worked. And Turing immediately began thinking about how to make it work better, how to handle more complex traffic, how to address the additional rotor that the German Navy was using for its most sensitive communications. I want to pause here and ask you to imagine what it was like to be one of the people who watched this happening in those early months. You were living in a country that had gone to war against the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. The German Wehrmacht had overrun Poland in 3 weeks, Denmark and Norway in a matter of days, and France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in 6 weeks. The British army had been evacuated from Dunkirk in a miracle of improvisation that had saved the men but lost almost all of their equipment. The Battle of Britain was being fought in the skies above southern England, and while the RAF was holding, the outcome was not guaranteed. The prospect of German invasion was real and was being planned for at every level of British government. Churchill was telling the public that they would fight on the beaches, fight in the fields, fight in the streets. And although those words were inspiring, the material reality behind them was that Britain was largely alone, largely outgunned, and largely dependent on American supplies that were themselves being sunk in terrifying quantities by German submarines. And in this hut in the Buckinghamshire countryside, a man in rumpled clothes who chained his tea mug to a radiator was building a machine that he believed could turn the tide. He was right, but no one outside Bletchley Park knew it yet. And even inside the park, the full implications of what was being achieved were still becoming clear. The Battle of the Atlantic was the crucible. This is a campaign that Churchill would later say frightened him more than any other aspect of the war. The German Navy submarine force, the Kriegsmarines U-Bootwaffe, operated in coordinated wolf packs guided by radio communications from submarine headquarters in Lorient, France, under Admiral Karl Donitz. These communications were encrypted on the naval Enigma, and they directed the wolf packs to intercept Allied convoys with precision that was devastating. In 1941, merchant shipping losses were running at a rate that, if sustained, would have starved Britain into submission within months. The math was brutal and simple. Britain needed to import a minimum amount of food and fuel and raw materials to survive, and the U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be built. The Admiralty knew that something had to change, and what changed was intelligence. When Bletchley began cracking naval Enigma traffic with increasing regularity in 1941, the Operational Intelligence Center at the Admiralty could begin routing convoys away from the areas where U-boats were known to be operating. Not every convoy, not every time. The intelligence was intermittent and incomplete, and the need to protect the source by never acting too obviously on it imposed agonizing constraints on how it could be used. But the effect on convoy losses was statistically visible, and the people of the Admiralty who were privy to the ultra-secret knew exactly what they were seeing. Then the Germans changed the naval Enigma. In February 1942, the U-boat switched to a four-rotor Enigma configuration that Bletchley had not yet solved. For 9 months, from February to December 1942, the most important intelligence source of the war went dark. This period is known at Bletchley as the Shark Blackout, named for the German network designation. During those 9 months, Atlantic convoy losses climbed back toward their worst levels. The wolf packs were operating blind, yes, but so were the convoy planners who could no longer route ships around them. It was the most dangerous period of the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was directly related to the inability to break the new Enigma variant. Turing threw himself into the four-rotor problem. He was working on it simultaneously with other work, simultaneously with thinking about computing, simultaneously with managing aspects of Bletchley's operations. The solution when it came required a combination of captured material, brilliant analysis by Turing and his colleagues, and the development of a more powerful version of the bomb that could handle the additional rotor. When Bletchley finally broke back into Shark in December 1942, the effect on the Atlantic campaign was immediate and profound. Within months, the tide had turned completely. By May 1943, Donitz was withdrawing the wolf packs from the North Atlantic because their losses had become unsustainable. What the German Navy never fully understood, and what the surviving German naval commanders were genuinely shocked to learn after the war, was that their communications had been read throughout much of the conflict. They had suspected it at various points. They had conducted security reviews. They had concluded, wrongly, that the Allies must have had extraordinary good fortune or excellent aerial reconnaissance. The idea that the fundamental security of Enigma had been compromised was, to them, literally unthinkable, which is exactly what Turing and his colleagues had counted on. The same intelligence was shaping events on every other front. In North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had been pushing British forces back in a seesaw campaign across the Libyan and Egyptian deserts, ultra-intelligence gave British commanders precise knowledge of Rommel's supply situation, his logistics, the timing and routes of Italian supply convoys, and his strategic intentions. Rommel was a brilliant tactical commander, perhaps the most gifted operational commander of the war, but he was operating in an environment where his opponents often knew more about his situation than he did. The supply convoy losses had slowly strangled his capacity to advance. The British awareness of his planned offensives before they began, the ability of the Eighth Army to position itself effectively in ways that seemed almost intuitive to the Germans who were observing it. All of this flowed, directly or indirectly, from the intelligence that Bletchley was generating. In the Mediterranean more broadly, when the Allies planned their invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, ultra-intelligence gave them detailed knowledge of German defensive dispositions and allowed them to build an elaborate deception operation, Operation Mincemeat, around the intelligence picture they knew the Germans would be constructing. A corpse dressed as a British staff officer and carrying fabricated invasion plans pointing to Sardinia and Greece was allowed to wash ashore in Spain. The Germans found the plans, evaluated them against their own intelligence picture, and concluded they were genuine. Ultra allowed the Allies to monitor German reactions in real time and confirmed that the deception was working. The Sicilian landings met significantly lighter resistance than they would otherwise have done. But all of this was building to something. Everything in the European theater from 1942 onward was building to something. The invasion of Western Europe. The operation that had to succeed because if it failed there was no alternative, because the Soviet Union was bleeding itself white in the East and the war could not be won without a second front in the West. The operation that Churchill called the most complex logistical undertaking in human history. The operation we call D-Day. I want to tell you about D-Day and the intelligence that shaped it in a way that goes beyond the familiar outlines of the story. Most people know that there was deception involved, that the Allies tried to convince the Germans that the invasion would land at the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Most people know about the double agents and the inflatable tanks and the fake army groups. What is less well understood is the role that ultra-intelligence played in making the deception work and in verifying, in almost real time, that it was working as planned. The German High Command in the spring of 1944 was certain that a major Allied invasion was coming. They had known it for more than a year. The question that consumed them, that Hitler himself obsessed over, was where? The Pas-de-Calais, the shortest channel crossing, The most direct route to Germany was the obvious choice. Hitler and many of his generals believed this was where the blow would fall, but others argued for Normandy. The debate was never fully resolved, and the uncertainty was exactly what the Allied deception planners intended to maintain and exploit. The deception operation was called Fortitude. It had two major components. Fortitude North, which was designed to convince the Germans that an invasion of Norway was being planned, tying down German divisions there that might otherwise have been available in France, and Fortitude South, which was a critical piece, designed to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion force would land at the Pas-de-Calais and that any Normandy landing was merely a feint. A fictional army group under General Patton, the commander the Germans most feared and respected, was invented and given a fictional order of battle, fictional radio traffic, and fictional training exercises in southeastern England, directly opposite the Pas-de-Calais. This deception was fed to the Germans through a network of double agents that was itself one of the most extraordinary intelligence achievements of the war. The XX Committee, also known as the 20 Committee from the double cross symbol, ran German agents who had been turned and were now sending false information back to their controllers in Germany. The most important of these was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard working under the codename Garbo, who had invented an entire network of fictitious sub-agents who were feeding information to German intelligence. His radio transmissions to Germany were considered so reliable by the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, that he was awarded the Iron Cross by Germany. He was also awarded an MBE by Britain, both simultaneously. But here is where Ultra was absolutely central to making all of this work. Because the double agents were feeding false information into the German intelligence system, and the question the Allied planners desperately needed to answer at every stage was, are the Germans believing it? Is the deception working? Are they actually holding their reserves for the Pas-de-Calais rather than committing them to Normandy? You could not answer this question by asking the Germans. You could not answer it by interviewing prisoners or examining captured documents in the weeks before the landings. You could only answer it if you could read German intelligence assessments and German military dispositions in near real time. Ultra gave the Allied planners exactly this capability, reading the German signals. Bletchley could see what picture the Germans were building of Allied intentions. They could see how each piece of false information fed through the double agent network was being evaluated and integrated into German assessments. They could see the German order of battle in France, which units were positioned where, which armor reserves were being held back, and on what instructions. And they could see, in the critical days before and immediately after the Normandy landings, whether the Germans believed that the landings were the real main effort or merely a diversion. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious operation in history landed on 5 beaches in Normandy. The American First Army landed at Utah and Omaha beaches. The British Second Army landed at Golden Sword. The Canadian 3rd Division landed at Juneau. From overhead came thousands of aircraft. From the sea came a fleet of nearly 7,000 ships. Across the beaches came more than 150,000 soldiers. The landings were contested, sometimes ferociously so. At Omaha Beach, the American forces suffered casualties that nearly broke the operation in its first hours. The cost was enormous, but the beaches were secured. The beachhead was established, and then the critical question became, would the Germans commit their armor reserves to destroy it before it could be consolidated? The German armor reserves included some of their most powerful panzer divisions, units that, if deployed immediately and in coordination, might very possibly have pushed the Normandy beachhead back into the sea. These reserves had been positioned as a general strategic reserve, and their deployment required Hitler's personal authorization. Hitler was asleep when the landings began. His staff were afraid to wake him. When he finally reviewed the situation, he was convinced, partly by the stream of false intelligence still flowing from the double agent network, and partly by his own pre-existing conviction, that the Normandy operation was a diversion. The real blow, he believed, was still coming at the Pas-de-Calais. The Panzer reserves were not committed, not on June 6th, not on June 7th, not on June 8th. Days passed in which the Allied beachhead grew stronger, the flow of follow-on forces and supplies accelerating, the defensive perimeter expanding, the lodgement area being transformed from a tenuous foothold to a genuine military position. By the time Hitler and his generals finally accepted that Normandy was not a feint, the moment when a major armored counterattack might have succeeded had passed. The window had closed. Ultra told the Allied commanders exactly what was happening on the German side of the situation in near real time. They could read the German deliberations, the instructions to hold the Panzer reserves, the continued assessments that the Pas-de-Calais operation was imminent. They could see the deception working, and they could plan accordingly, knowing that the window of maximum danger was being held open by the Germans' own confusion. The significance of those days, those particular days in June 1944, when the German armored reserve sat idle while the Allied beachhead solidified, is very nearly impossible to overstate. Military historians who have modeled the various scenarios are nearly unanimous that a coordinated armored counterattack on June 6th or June 7th, with the full weight of the available Panzer reserves, would have had a very strong probability of breaking the Normandy operation. The beaches were not secure. The follow-on forces had not yet landed. The Allies were at their most vulnerable. The Panzers did not come because the Germans did not believe the moment had arrived, and the Germans did not believe it because of an intelligence deception that was verified and calibrated in real time using Turing's work. This is the shape of what Alan Turing's genius meant for the war, not as an abstraction, not as a generality. At the most specific, most crucial, most irreversible moment of the entire European campaign, the work that began at a wooden desk at Bletchley Park with pencil and paper was operating in the world, shaping events, determining outcomes. The Normandy landing succeeded. The liberation of Western Europe began. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and Alan Turing received the Order of the British Empire in a brief ceremony about which he was told almost nothing specific, because the work he had actually done could not be discussed. In the summer of 1945, with the war over and the most elaborate intelligence operation in history being methodically concealed behind layers of classification, Turing moved to the National Physical Laboratory in London to work on the project he had been thinking about in some form since before the war. He called it the Automatic Computing Engine, the ACE, and the design he produced in late 1945 was the most technically advanced proposal for a stored program electronic computer that existed anywhere in the world at that moment. The Americans at the Moore School of Electrical Engineering in Philadelphia had built the ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, which was the first general-purpose electronic computer and which became operational in early 1946. It was a formidable achievement, but it was not a stored program computer. It was programmed by physically reconfiguring its wiring, which made reprogramming it an exercise that took days. Turing's ACE design included the stored program concept, the idea that the instructions of the machine's operation would be stored in the same memory as the data it was working on, allowing it to be reprogrammed rapidly and in principle to execute any algorithm. The stored program concept was developed approximately simultaneously and roughly along parallel lines by Turing, by John von Neumann working at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and by the Eckert-Mauchly team in Philadelphia. There is genuine historical debate about who should receive primary credit, and the debate involves some real complexity about who communicated with whom and when. But what is not in dispute is that Turing's ACE design was technically sophisticated, that it included details about the instruction set and the memory architecture and the programming interface that were in several respects more advanced than what was being proposed elsewhere, and that the National Physical Laboratory's institutional caution in building it delayed its realization by years. Turing was not good at institutional patience. He found the committee structures, the request for additional documentation, the seemingly endless deferral of actual construction decisions maddening. He worked on the ACE design with increasing frustration through 1946 and 1947, then took sabbatical at Cambridge during which he worked on neural network models, and began thinking more explicitly about machine intelligence. He returned to find the NPL still not building his computer. In 1948, he accepted a position at Manchester University, where Freddie Williams and Tom Kilburn were actually building computer rather than holding committees about building one. The Manchester Mark I, which became operational in 1949, incorporated some of Turing's contributions and was one of the first stored program computers in the world to run actual programs. The NPL finally built a version of Turing's ACE, the Pilot ACE, which became operational in 1950, and when tested it was the fastest computer in the world. What might have been running in 1947 or 1948 was finally running in 1950. It was in 1950 that Turing published a paper that defines his intellectual legacy, perhaps even more completely than his work on Enigma, precisely because the Enigma work was secret for so long, and this paper was not. Computing Machinery and Intelligence appeared in the journal Mind in October 1950, and opened with a question of such direct and beautiful simplicity that it has never stopped resonating. I propose to consider the question, can machines think? What followed was one of the most carefully constructed and intellectually honest scientific papers of the 20th century. Turing did not claim that machines could think in the way humans think. He did something more interesting and more intellectually rigorous. He pointed out that the concept of thinking was itself not well defined, and that any attempt to answer a question in those terms would get lost immediately in philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness and the definitions of terms. Instead, he proposed an operational test. He called it the imitation game. In the original formulation, a human interrogator communicates via written messages with two entities, one human and one machine. The interrogator's task is to determine which is which. If the machine can perform this task well enough that an interrogator can distinguish it from a human no more than half the time, the machine is considered to be demonstrating something indistinguishable from intelligence. The test sidesteps the philosophical question of whether the machine is really thinking and replaces it with a behavioral question. Can it do what thinking things do? The paper then systematically engaged with objections to machine intelligence, one by one. The theological objection: God gave humans immortal souls and capacity for thought, and machines have neither. Turing's response was characteristically gentle and precise. This argument proves too much, since it would also imply that humans could not give other humans a capacity for thought, which seems clearly wrong. The mathematical objection, based on Gödel's theorems: any machine operated within a formal system will encounter questions it cannot answer, which humans can. Turing acknowledged the mathematical point, while questioning whether it had the implications for machine intelligence that its proponents assumed. The argument from consciousness: machines cannot truly think because they have no inner experience, no subjective awareness of their own operations. Turing noted that this argument, taken seriously, would lead to solipsism, since we have no direct access to the inner experience of other humans either. We infer it from behavior. He engaged with objections about creativity, about learning, about the capacity for surprise. He proposed that a machine designed to learn from experience rather than to execute fixed programs might be able to acquire capabilities that its original programming did not explicitly contain. He speculated about what it would mean to program a machine to play chess, or to appreciate music, or to write poetry. He was careful throughout to distinguish between what had been demonstrated and what was merely speculated, between the hard questions and the easy ones. And then he made his prediction. By the year 2000, he wrote, machines would be able to play the imitation game well enough to fool an average interrogator about 30% of the time after 5 minutes of questioning. This was not a technological forecast in the precise engineering sense. It was a statement of direction, a way of saying, this is coming, this is real, this is not science fiction, and the world needs to begin thinking about what it means. He was 38 years old when he wrote this, and he was pointing toward a horizon he knew he would not live to see. The paper was published. It was read by everyone in the emerging field of computing. It defined the questions that artificial intelligence research would pursue for the next 70 years. Every significant figure in the history of AI, from John McCarthy, who coined the term, to Marvin Minsky, to the generations of researchers who followed them, built on the foundations that Turing had laid in that paper. The question of machine intelligence, which Turing had transformed from a philosophical curiosity into a research program, became one of the defining technological and philosophical challenges of human civilization. While he was writing that paper, and in the months and years that followed, Turing was also pursuing work in a field that seems at first entirely unrelated to everything I have described so far, but that reveals more clearly than anything else the extraordinary range of his mind. He was thinking about biological pattern formation. He was thinking about how a fertilized egg, which begins as a single cell with no discernible difference between one side and the other, manages to develop into a complex organism with clearly defined structures, organs in predictable positions, patterns on its surface that are consistent across individuals of the same species. How does a leopard know where to put its spots? How does a zebra know how to make its stripes? How does a developing embryo know which cells should become a head and which should become a tail? These questions may seem far from computing, but to Turing they were the same kind of question he had always pursued. How does complex, organized behavior emerge from simple, local rules? His 1952 paper, The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, proposed a mathematical model in which two chemicals, which he called morphogens, diffused through developing tissue and reacted with each other in ways that produced instabilities, and those instabilities created the patterns we see in nature. The reaction-diffusion model, as it came to be known, has proved to be one of the most fruitful ideas in developmental biology. Researchers in the 21st century have found direct experimental evidence for exactly the kinds of morphogen gradients and reaction-diffusion dynamics that Turing predicted, in systems ranging from the skin patterns of fish to the spacing of hair follicles to the formation of fingers in the vertebrate hand. He was doing this work, this profound and original biological mathematics, while simultaneously being subjected to what the British legal system considered justice. In January 1952, Turing reported a burglary at his house in Wilmslow. During the police investigation that followed, the officers learned that Turing had had a sexual relationship with a 19-year-old man named Arnold Murray. Homosexuality was a criminal offense in Britain, as it had been since 1885, under legislation originally passed to address what Victorian moral reformers called gross indecency. Oscar Wilde had been prosecuted and imprisoned under this law in 1895. In 1952, it was still on the books, enforced with varying degrees of enthusiasm by different police forces, but carrying potential penalties of imprisonment and, as a judicial alternative, hormonal treatment. Turing did not deny what had happened. He answered police questions with a directness that was characteristic of him, apparently without fully understanding or perhaps fully accepting that the society around him would treat a private relationship between two consenting adults as a matter for the criminal courts. He was charged, tried, and convicted. The conviction was for gross indecency. He was offered a choice between prison and a course of chemical treatment through estrogen injections, a procedure described at the time as organotherapy and intended to reduce sexual drive. He chose the injections. The treatment lasted for a year. Its physical effects included the development of breast tissue, a consequence that was neither mentioned to Turing in advance as a likely outcome nor apparently considered relevant by the court or the medical system administering the treatment. Its effects on his psychological state, his mood, his sense of himself and his body, we cannot know with certainty. He was not someone who wrote extensively about his inner life. His friends and colleagues later reported that he seemed to handle the situation with a kind of wry, almost attached equanimity, making ironic jokes about his situation, continuing to work, continuing to correspond with colleagues about mathematics and biology and computing. Whether this equanimity was genuine, whether it was a performance of stoicism that concealed something very different, whether it was the only emotional mode available to him in circumstances that left him no other options, we cannot know. What we do know is that his security clearance was revoked. The man who had kept the most important secret in British history for years, who had never breathed a word of what had happened at Bletchley Park to anyone outside the classified community, was now considered a security risk. The reasoning of the security services was explicit. Homosexual men were presumed to be vulnerable to blackmail, and therefore could not be trusted with classified information. The fact that Turing had never been blackmailed, had no apparent inclination toward disloyalty, and had demonstrated over a period of years under intense stress capacity for discretion that almost no one has ever matched, was apparently not considered relevant. I want to be precise about what this meant in practice. The work that Turing had been doing in the classified domain after the war, consultancy work for GCHQ, the organization that had grown from Bletchley Park's wartime operation, work on the next generation of cryptanalytic techniques, work on the electronic computing tools that were now central to British intelligence operations, all of this stopped. The most qualified person in the country to think about the intersection of computing and intelligence, the person who had invented the theoretical framework for the entire field, was cut off from that work because of his private life. He was, at the time of his conviction, actively pursuing what would become the mathematical theory of morphogenesis. He had a paper in progress on the nonlinear aspects of reaction diffusion systems. He had correspondence ongoing with colleagues about machine intelligence, about chess-playing algorithms, about the possibility of programming computers to learn. He was, in every measurable dimension, at the height of his powers. The conviction and its consequences did not stop him from working, but it stopped him from working on some of the things he was best equipped to work on, and it placed him in a social and legal position that made the rest of his life not just difficult, but humiliating in ways that no amount of retrospective sympathy can undo. I want to tell you about something that happened in the summer of 1942 that almost nobody talks about when they talk about Turing and Bletchley, but that reveals something profound about who he was and how he operated in the world. At a certain point in the war, when the resources available to Bletchley Park were not keeping pace with the volume of German encrypted traffic that needed to be processed, when requests for more bomb machines and more staff and more resources were moving through the bureaucracy at a pace that felt to the people doing the actual work as though it was designed to produce their failure, Turing did something almost unimaginable for someone of his temperament and social habits. He wrote a letter. He wrote directly to Winston Churchill. The letter was co-signed by his colleagues Gordon Welchman, Hugh Alexander, and Stuart Milner Barry. It was addressed personally to the Prime Minister. It described, in terms that were frank to the point of being alarming, the resource constraints under which the code breakers were operating. It listed specific bottlenecks. It explained what those bottlenecks were costing in terms of unread intelligence. And it asked for Churchill's personal intervention to break through the bureaucratic resistance that had prevented the necessary resources from being allocated. Sending this letter was, by any reasonable measure, a significant professional risk, going over the heads of your immediate superiors, of the entire chain of command, all the way to the Prime Minister, in a letter that implicitly criticized the management of the operation, was not the kind of thing that typically ended well for the people who did it. But Turing and his colleagues had tried every other channel available to them, and the situation was not improving, and so they wrote the letter. Churchill read it. Churchill's response was immediate and decisive. He sent a memorandum to his chief of staff, General Ismay, with a handwritten note at the top that had become famous in the history of British intelligence. "Make sure they have all they want on extreme priority," Churchill wrote, "and report to me that this has been done." The resources came. The bottlenecks were cleared. The operational tempo at Bletchley increased. And the intelligence that flowed from that increased tempo continued to shape the war. This episode tells you something important about Turing that is easy to lose sight of in the larger story. He was not passive. He was not a man who accepted constraints that he believed were wrong simply because they came from authority. He was, in his own unusual way, willing to fight for what he believed was necessary. He had learned at Bletchley that the work was too important and too fragile to leave to the mercy of routine institutional processes. And when those processes failed, he acted. This same directness, this same refusal to pretend that things were other than they were, is what led him to answer police questions honestly about his relationship with Arnold Murray in 1952. It cost him everything, but it was completely consistent with who he was. Turing did not perform normality. He was not equipped for it, and he did not try in a different world, one that deserved him. This quality would have been recognized as what it actually was, a form of moral courage. Let me also tell you about the work he did during a trip to America in the autumn of 1942, because this too is part of the story that gets squeezed out by the more dramatic narratives. In November 1942, Turing traveled to the United States, officially to consult with American cryptographers who were setting up their own code-breaking operation, partly inspired by what Bletchley had achieved. The American operation, which would eventually be based in Washington at a facility called Arlington Hall and at a naval facility in Massachusetts, was beginning to tackle Japanese naval codes and would eventually play an enormous role in the Pacific War. But the Americans were also beginning to work on German Enigma, and they needed to understand what Bletchley had done. Turing spent time with the American cryptographers, sharing enough of the methodology to allow them to build their own bomb machines, which they did, and which contributed significantly to the Allied code-breaking effort. The Americans were impressed. Their own mathematical talent was formidable, but they recognized in Turing something categorically different from the standard run of brilliant people. His ability to see through the surface complexity of a problem to its underlying structure, to identify the essential logical relationship that could be exploited, was something they had not encountered in quite that form before. While he was in America, he also visited Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, which was then the premier industrial research facility in the world, and where some of the most important work in electronics and communications theory was being done. There he met and had extended conversations with Claude Shannon, the mathematician who was independently developing what would become information theory. Shannon's work, published formally in 1948 as A Mathematical Theory of Communication, would prove to be one of the foundational contributions of the 20th century, defining the mathematical language of digital communication and laying the theoretical groundwork for everything from satellite transmission to data compression to the internet. Shannon and Turing were working on related problems from different angles, and their conversations at Bell Labs were, by later accounts, wide-ranging and mutually stimulating. It is extraordinary to contemplate. In the autumn of 1942 in New Jersey, the two men who were laying the theoretical foundations for the digital world, Turing with the computability theory and his work on machine intelligence, Shannon with his information theory, were sitting in the same room and talking about what they were thinking. Neither of them could have known at that moment exactly what the other's work would ultimately mean, because neither field existed yet in anything like its mature form. They were both building something that did not yet have a name. Shannon later recalled that Turing was primarily interested in two things during their Bell Labs conversations: the possibility of building a thinking machine, which Shannon found provocative but not implausible, and the question of how to define intelligence in terms precise enough to be operationalized in a machine. These were exactly the questions that Turing would address publicly in his 1950 paper. He was working on them in 1942, 8 years before the paper appeared. The depth of his thinking on these questions, the patience with which he held them and turned them over and refined them over years, is one of the things that makes the eventual product so good. Now let me bring you back to Bletchley Park for the last time, because I want to tell you about something that most accounts of the Enigma operation underemphasize, and that is the human cost. Not the cost in lives saved, which was enormous and which I have tried convey, but the cost of the people who were doing the work, the cost of what it meant to hold that much responsibility in that kind of silence for that long. The people who worked at Bletchley Park were required, under the Official Secrets Act, to say absolutely nothing about what they were doing, not to their families, not to their closest friends, not to anyone. If your husband or wife or parent or child asked you what you did all day, you said nothing meaningful. If people asked why you were stationed in the Buckinghamshire countryside rather than in uniform at the front, you said nothing meaningful. If you came home looking gray with exhaustion after a particularly hard stretch, and someone who loved you asked what was wrong, you said nothing meaningful. This was not just a professional requirement. It was an emotional and psychological condition of permanent, enforced isolation in the most intimate areas of life, for years, for some people, for the rest of their lives. And what were they holding in silence? They were holding the knowledge that the decisions they made every day, the traffic they read or failed to read, the ships that were saved or sunk based on intelligence they did or did not manage to produce, had direct and immediate consequences for human life. When they succeeded, when a convoy was rerouted away from a wolf pack, when an Allied force avoided an ambush, when a German supply convoy was intercepted at sea, they knew in the way that people who work in hospitals know when a patient survives, with a combination of professional satisfaction and almost overwhelming awareness of the human weight of the work. And when they failed, when the traffic was too hard to break in time, when the intelligence came too late, when ships were sunk or soldiers died in situations where different intelligence might have made a difference, they knew that too, and they held it in silence, because they could not tell anyone. They could not share the grief or the guilt or the achievement with anyone who was not cleared to hear it. They went home to people who did not know what they had been through, and they got up the next morning and went back to do it again. Turing was not exempt from this. He was, in some ways, the person who carried the most of it, because his role was not just operational. He was one of the principal architects of the entire enterprise. When the operation succeeded, the success was built on foundations he had designed. When it ran into difficulty, the difficulty was in a system he was responsible for. He lived with this for years, in the enforced silence that the Official Secrets Act required, and then he lived with a different silence for the rest of his life. The silence of a man who had done extraordinary things that no one around him was allowed to know. Think about what it means to have your most significant achievements kept secret, not from strangers, from everyone, from your friends, your colleagues, your family. When Turing received the Order of the British Empire, he could not tell his mother, who loved him fiercely and took immense pride in his mathematical achievements, what he had actually done to earn it. When former colleagues from Bletchley encountered him in peacetime settings, they might exchange a glance, but they could not speak directly about what they had shared. The thing that defined his contribution to his country, perhaps the defining public achievement of his life, was invisible to the world he lived in. Imagine carrying that. Imagine carrying it while also being prosecuted, stripped of your clearance, subjected to hormonal treatment that altered your body. Imagine being 41 years old and knowing that the greatest work of your life cannot be spoken of, that the recognition you might have received, that you had surely earned, is impossible under the law that has both defined your service and destroyed your standing. And here is something that I want you to hold on to, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that came after. Even if Turing had never been prosecuted, even if his private life had been entirely invisible to the state, as was the case for many gay men of his generation who were more discreet, even if he had lived another 30 or 40 years in the kind of comfortable academic security that his talents deserved, even in that much better world, he would still have been forbidden to tell anyone about Bletchley for decades. The secrecy was not a consequence of his persecution. It was a separate, additional layer of isolation. He was carrying two silences simultaneously. The silence of the Official Secrets Act, which was shared by thousands of other Bletchley veterans, and the silence of the private self that a society had decided was criminal. Now, let me tell you about what happened when the silence was finally broken, not just the publication of the Ultra Secret in 1974, but the longer, more complicated process by which the full picture of Turing's contribution came to be understood and eventually, in some partial and inadequate way, acknowledged. The historians who began piecing together the Bletchley story in the 1970s and 1980s worked under significant constraints. Many of the relevant documents were still classified. Many of the principals were dead, and those who were still alive had spent decades keeping the secret and did not find it easy to speak about it even after they were formally released from their obligations. The institutional culture of British intelligence was, and remains, deeply reluctant to discuss its operations, and even the partial releases of classified material that occurred over the following decades were incomplete and sometimes misleading. Turing presented a particular challenge. His wartime work was central to everything, but he had been dead since 1954 and could not be interviewed. His papers and correspondence were scattered. His former colleagues would speak about the general outlines of what had happened, but were often cautious about specific attributions, partly out of genuine modesty, and partly out of sense that the achievement had been collective and that singling out individuals might misrepresent how it actually worked, and the prosecution that had ended his career. And perhaps his life was a subject that many of his former colleagues found painful and preferred not to dwell on. The result was that the public understanding of Turing's contribution developed in stages, with each stage revealing more, but also, sometimes, creating new distortions. The narrative that emerged in popular culture from the 1980s and 1990s onward tended to be a hero narrative. One extraordinary genius, working largely alone, defeated the Enigma and won the war. This narrative is not wrong in its broad strokes, but it smooths over the collaborative reality of Bletchley, the crucial contributions of dozens of other people, and the institutional context that made the operation possible. It also, paradoxically, can obscure the true depth of Turing's contribution by making it seem more dramatic and less technical than it actually was. The real achievement was not the dramatic moment of cracking the code. It was the years of patient, systematic, theoretically sophisticated work that made systematic decryption possible in the first place. The film The Imitation Game, released in 2014, brought Turing's story to a mass audience that had not previously known it. The film has significant historical inaccuracies, as historical dramas almost always do, and historians have documented these carefully. The characterization of Turing as entirely isolated and personally difficult is not supported by the accounts of people who knew him, many of whom describe him as warm, funny, and genuinely enjoyable to work with, if unconventional. The suggestion that Turing and his team were specifically protected by a colleague who might have exposed them was invented for dramatic purposes. The timeline of the bomb's development was compressed, and simplified in ways that misrepresent the actual history. But the film succeeded in making Turing's story visible to millions of people who had not previously known it, and in conveying, even imperfectly, the essential injustice of what happened to him. The wave of public attention that followed the film, the renewed calls for formal recognition, the campaign that ultimately produced a royal pardon, and then the Turing Law, was partly a consequence of the film's reach. The inaccuracies are real and matter to historians. But the film's existence in the world has done more to spread awareness of Turing's contribution than any number of scholarly books and academic papers. These are the complicated trade-offs of popular history, and they are worth acknowledging honestly. What I want you to understand, having heard all of this, is that the story of Alan Turing is not over. It is not a story that ended with his death in 1954, or with the royal pardon in 2013, or with his face on the 50-pound note in 2021. It is an ongoing story, because the questions he was asking are the questions that define the world we are living in right now. The machines that are thinking or appearing to think, or doing something in the neighborhood of thinking that we do not yet have quite the right words for, are here. They are writing code and answering questions and generating images and analyzing documents and engaging in conversations that Turing, in his 1950 paper, predicted would eventually be indistinguishable from human conversations. We are inside the horizon he pointed toward. We are living in the world his questions made possible. And we are still wrestling with the implications, just as he wrestled with them. The question of what it means for a machine to be intelligent, which he posed with such clarity and such care, is not a question we have answered. We have built systems that pass various versions of the Turing test in various constrained settings. We are not sure what that means. We are not sure what it implies about consciousness, about the nature of intelligence, about the moral status of systems that behave intelligently. These questions are live and contested and consequential in ways that they were not when Turing first asked them, because the systems that make them urgent were hypothetical then and are operational now. Turing did not tell us what to conclude. He told us what to ask, and he told us how to ask it rigorously. That is what great theorists do. They do not hand you the answers. They hand you the questions and the tools to pursue them. And the questions Turing handed us are ones we are still learning to use properly. In June 2023, 111 years after Turing's birth, the artificial intelligence laboratory Anthropic released a system called Claude. It was named obliquely in the tradition of human names for AI systems, and was built on principles that traced, through many intervening steps and researchers, back to the research program that Turing had defined in 1950. Whether it thinks, in any meaningful sense of the word, is precisely the kind of question that Turing would have found interesting, not easily answered, requiring careful operationalization, deserving of serious, rigorous, honest inquiry rather than either dismissal or uncritical acceptance. Turing's influence on the systems that now pervade daily life is not metaphorical and not merely historical. The architecture of every digital computer is an implementation of his theoretical framework. The question that all artificial intelligence research addresses is the question he posed. The test that is used as a shorthand for AI capability is his test. The conversation you are having right now with any AI system, anywhere in any form, is a conversation that takes place within the intellectual universe that Alan Turing created in a series of papers and machines and ideas produced between 1936 and 1954. He was 41 years old. He had a half-eaten apple on his bedside table, and the world he was making is still being made. In June 2023, his hometown of Wilmslow, in Cheshire, finally dedicated a permanent memorial in the town where he had lived and where he had died. People visit it. They bring apples. The world, slowly and imperfectly and too late, tries to say what it should have said when he was alive. In June 2054, if anyone is there to observe it, it will be the 100-year anniversary of Alan Turing's death. In 100 years, the computers that run the world will trace their ancestry in a direct and traceable intellectual line to the papers he wrote. The questions that guide the development of artificial intelligence will be the questions he asked. The test that measures machine intelligence will bear his name. And whatever is running on those computers, whatever those systems are doing that we cannot currently imagine, it will be doing on foundations that Alan Turing laid when he was 23 years old, lie in a meadow in Cambridge, thinking about what it meant for something to be computable. That is the measure of a mind, not the awards it receives, not the recognition it is given while it is alive, but the permanence of the questions it asks and the durability of the foundations it builds. By those measures, Alan Turing stands among the handful of minds in human history whose contribution to what comes after is both foundational and incalculable. And the world, which took 50 years to tell the truth about what he did and several more decades to apologize for what it did to him, is still learning how to reckon with what it means to have had someone like that and have treated him the way it did. In June 2054, his housekeeper arrived at his house in Wilmslow and found him dead in his bed. Let me take you one more place before we end the story. Let me take you to the question of what it means right now, today, in this specific moment of history, to be living in the world that Alan Turing made. Because I think there is something important in the synchrony between the moment when his story is finally being fully told and the moment when his intellectual legacy is becoming most visible. We are living through what historians will almost certainly describe as the most significant technological transition since the Industrial Revolution. The systems that are being built and deployed right now, the large language models, the generative AI systems, the increasingly capable artificial intelligence that is beginning to be integrated into medicine and law and education and scientific research and countless other domains are systems whose fundamental conceptual architecture was laid out by Alan Turing in the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s. Not vaguely, not in a general inspirational sense. In a direct, traceable, intellectual genealogy that runs from Turing's paper on computable numbers through the development of the stored program computer through the emergence of artificial intelligence as a research field through the neural network approaches of the 1980s and 1990s, through the deep learning revolution of the 2010s to the systems operating today. Every step in that chain built on the one before it. Every researcher who advanced the field stood on the shoulders of the researchers who had come before them. And at the very base of the chain, holding everything else up, is the theoretical framework that Turing constructed. The idea that any computation can be described formally, that any formally describable computation can be implemented in a universal machine, and that the question of whether a machine is intelligent is a question about behavior rather than about substrate. This last point is the one that matters most for understanding what is happening right now. Turing's operational definition of intelligence as what intelligent things do rather than intelligence as some mysterious internal property that either is or is not present, was controversial when he proposed it in 1950. It remains controversial today. There are philosophers and cognitive scientists and neuroscientists who argue that there is something about human consciousness that cannot be captured by behavioral equivalence, that a system can behave intelligently in every measurable way while lacking something essential that makes intelligence genuine. This position has philosophical force and cannot be easily dismissed. But the systems we are building today do not wait for the philosophical debate to be resolved. They are being built, deployed, and used on the assumption that behavioral capability is what matters for most practical purposes. When a medical AI system analyzes a radiological image and identifies a tumor that a human radiologist might miss, the practical question is not whether the AI truly understands what it is seeing. The practical question is whether its analysis is accurate. When a natural language AI system reads a legal contract and identifies potentially problematic clauses, the question is not whether the AI has genuine comprehension. The question is whether it finds what needs to be found. Turing's pragmatic behavioral definition of intelligence is, whether we acknowledge it explicitly or not, the operating assumption of the AI industry. He was right about this. He was right in a way that 70 years of subsequent debate and development have confirmed rather than refuted. The question of whether machines can think, posed with his characteristic precision in 1950, has been answered in a practical sense by the systems operating today, in exactly the way he predicted. Machines can do what thinking things do, at least for a growing range of tasks. Whether they are genuinely thinking in some deeper sense is a question that remains genuinely open, and Turing, who was careful and honest about exactly what he was claiming, would not have claimed it was closed. Now I want to tell you about something that happened in the process of writing about the history of artificial intelligence that strikes me as almost unbearably poignant. When researchers began tracing the development of the field in the 1980s and 1990s, when the history of AI was young enough that the founding documents were still relatively recent and the founding figures were often still alive and could be interviewed. One of the things that emerged with remarkable consistency was how often Turing's name came up, not as a distant historical predecessor, but as a genuine intellectual presence, a figure whose papers were still being read and discussed and argued about, and whose questions were still the animating questions of the field. John McCarthy, who coined the term artificial intelligence in 1956 at a summer workshop at Dartmouth that is traditionally cited as the founding event of AI as a formal research field, was explicit about his debt to Turing. Marvin Minsky, McCarthy's collaborator and another of the field's founding figures, was equally clear. The researchers who developed the first programs capable of solving mathematical problems, playing chess, understanding simple natural language, learning from examples, were all working within a conceptual framework that Turing had defined. They were, in a very real sense, working on the implementation of ideas that he had articulated at a time when the computers capable of implementing them did not yet exist. There's something almost heartbreaking about this. Turing died in 1954, 2 years before the Dartmouth workshop that formally constituted the field he had founded. He never attended that workshop. He never saw the community that his work had made possible gather and give itself a name and commit to a program of research. He never saw the first chess programs, the first theorem provers, the first natural language understanding systems, the first machine learning algorithms that built on his insights. He was gone before any of it existed in operational form. The field that bears his intellectual paternity was constituted without him. Its practitioners honored him by building on what he had done, but they could not ask him questions. They could not benefit from his thinking about the directions they were taking. They could not receive his assessment of whether the approaches they were developing were on the right track or missing something important. The conversation that he had started in 1950, the conversation about machine intelligence that has only grown larger and more urgent in the decade since, was forced to continue without him from the very beginning. What would he have contributed to that conversation? I have said that we cannot know, and that is true, but I can tell you what we know about how his mind worked, and from that you can form your own judgment. He was not someone who followed the established path once he had identified a better one. The best evidence we have about how Turing engaged with intellectual problems suggests that he was likely to have seen very early what the fundamental limitations of each approach were and where the real difficulties lay. The history of artificial intelligence research from the 1950s onward is, in significant part, a history of optimistic approaches running into walls that were not anticipated, followed by periods of reassessment and reorientation. The Dartmouth summer of 1956 produced confident predictions about the rapid development of machine intelligence that proved to be wildly over-optimistic. The AI winters of the 1970s and 1980s were the consequence of those unmet expectations. Turing's 1950 paper is notable for its intellectual honesty about what would be required for machine intelligence to develop. He was not naively optimistic. He understood that the problem was hard. He understood that the path from where computing was in 1950 to the systems he was imagining required decades of work and would encounter genuine difficulties. His prediction about the year 2000 was calibrated to what he actually believed, not to what he hoped or what would be most impressive to announce. A Turing who had lived through the AI winners of the 1970s and 1980s, who had watched the gap between the early promise and the actual achievement become apparent, might have been one of the people most capable of understanding why it was happening and what needed to change. Instead, the field had to learn these lessons without him, which it did, eventually, though the process took decades and cost enormous amounts of wasted effort. Whether a living Turing would have shortened that process, whether his ability to see through the surface of a problem to its underlying structure would have identified the fundamental limitations of early symbolic AI, before the field had to discover them the hard way, is another of the unknowable counterfactuals that his early death makes unavoidable. But here's what I want to leave you with, because this is where the story of Alan Turing stops being just a historical tragedy and becomes something more urgent, the transition we are living through right now. The emergence of genuinely capable artificial intelligence systems is raising exactly the questions that Turing raised in 1950, not as abstract philosophy, but as urgent practical questions with real consequences for how we organize society and who benefits from the technology and who bears its costs. Who is intelligent? What are the rights of intelligent entities? How do we verify intelligence, and what does verification mean for how we should treat the things verified as intelligent? These questions, when Turing asked them, were theoretical. When researchers at Dartmouth asked them in 1956, they were ambitious but still distant. Today, they're immediate. The systems that are being deployed right now are raising these questions in ways that require answers, and the answers are not obvious. And the process of working them out will determine important aspects of what kind of future the people now alive will live in. Turing, who first posed the question seriously, is not here to contribute to working them out, but the rigor and the precision and the intellectual honesty with which he posed them are the best model available for how the working out should proceed. He did not pretend that hard questions were easy. He did not allow the magnitude of the stakes to push him toward premature conclusions. He sat with the difficulty. He defined the terms carefully. He acknowledged the limits of what he knew and distinguished them clearly from what he was speculating about. These are the qualities that the current conversation about artificial intelligence desperately needs and frequently lacks. His influence on this conversation is real even in his absence. Every researcher in AI who has read his 1950 paper, which means effectively every researcher in AI, has been shaped by the way he framed the questions. The test that bears his name, whatever its limitations as a technical metric, has shaped how the field thinks about what it is trying to achieve. The fundamental assumption that intelligence is behavioral, that the question of whether something is intelligent is a question about what it does rather than about what it is made of, runs through the entire field as a background assumption that most practitioners hold without explicitly articulating it. Turing put that assumption there. He is, in the most literal possible sense, present in the conversations happening right now in research laboratories and boardrooms and legislative chambers and philosophical departments around the world about the nature and implications of artificial intelligence. He is present as the person who asked the questions first and who asked them most clearly. He is present as a ghost in the machine, in the most generous and literal sense of that phrase. A man who was not allowed to speak for 50 years has been speaking for 70 years since his death. He is speaking through every computer that runs, through every AI system that operates, through every conversation about machine intelligence that takes seriously the questions he raised. His silence has been broken in the best possible way, not by revelation but by consequence, not by announcement but by the accumulation of a world that his ideas made. He saved your life. He built the intellectual architecture of the world you live in. He was 41 years old when he died, and he had been forbidden to tell you what he had done for you, and his government treated him as a criminal for being who he was. And still, from that silence and that injustice and that early ending, the work persists, the questions endure, the foundations hold. That is the measure of Alan Turing. That is the size of the debt we owe him. And that is why, in every way available to us, we should refuse to let his story be forgotten, not just as a historical fact, but as a living reminder of what genius looks like, what injustice looks like, and what it means to build something that outlasts both. But I want to linger a little longer in the war itself, because there are chapters of how Ultra was used that we have not yet fully explored, and they matter to understanding the complete scope of what Bletchley produced. The North African campaign, the Italian campaign, the destruction of the German supply lines in the Mediterranean, the precise targeting of Rommel's fuel convoys. These are all stories that deserve more space than history typically gives them. And they are all stories in which the intelligence from Bletchley was not just useful but decisive. Consider what happened in the Western Desert in 1942. Rommel's Afrika Korps had been running rings around British and Commonwealth forces for more than a year. The German general was genuinely brilliant, capable of tactical improvisation that left his opponents perpetually off balance. But Rommel had an Achilles heel that he did not know about, and that his opponents, thanks to Ultra, were increasingly able to exploit. His supply lines ran across the Mediterranean from Italy to the North African coast, and those supply convoys traveled routes and on schedules that were communicated via Enigma. The Royal Navy and the RAF, using intelligence derived from Bletchley, were able to identify and intercept Italian supply convoys with precision that the Germans found inexplicable. Tankers carrying fuel, supply ships carrying ammunition and spare parts, troop transports carrying reinforcements. They were sunk in numbers that reduced Rommel's operational capacity steadily and relentlessly through the second half of 1942. At crucial moments, including the Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942, Rommel's ability to mount sustained offensive operations was directly limited by fuel shortages that were themselves a direct consequence of convoy losses, that were themselves a direct consequence of intelligence from Bletchley. General Montgomery, commanding the British Eighth Army at El Alamein, knew things about Rommel's logistical situation that Rommel himself did not fully know. He knew which convoys had been sunk, which supplies had not arrived, where the fuel reserves were and were not. He could time his operations to strike when Rommel was at his most constrained. The Battle of El Alamein was, in military terms, a grinding attritional engagement in which the British superiority in material and manpower eventually told. But the margin by which it told, the speed and completeness of the German defeat, was shaped significantly by the intelligence picture that Ultra provided. And then there's the Italian campaign of 1943 and 1944, which is often treated in popular history as a sideshow, a muddy, bloody struggle up the length of the Italian peninsula that was important mainly as a drain on German resources. But Ultra transformed the Italian campaign as it transformed every other theater where it operated. The Allied commanders in Italy had detailed knowledge of German defensive positions, of the strength and disposition of German units, of the supply situations and reinforcement schedules that determined where and when the Germans could mount serious resistance. This did not make the Italian campaign easy. The terrain was too difficult and the Germans too capable of stubborn offensive fighting for intelligence alone to produce quick victories. But it shaped the campaign in ways that reduced Allied casualties, that prevented costly mistakes, and that allowed the Allied advance to proceed with consistency that would have been impossible in the absence of that intelligence. And there is one more chapter we want to tell you about, because it illustrates something important about the limits of what Ultra could do and the ways in which intelligence, even the best intelligence in history, cannot fully substitute for judgment and leadership. The story of Operation Market Garden in September 1944. By September 1944, the Normandy breakout had succeeded spectacularly. Allied forces had swept across France with a speed that surprised even the most optimistic Allied planners. Paris had been liberated. Brussels had been liberated. The German army in the West was in full retreat, disorganized and demoralized. The question was how to exploit the success, how to convert the retreat into a rout, and end the war before winter. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed an audacious plan. A massive airborne operation would drop Allied paratroops along a corridor to the Netherlands, seizing a series of bridges over the major rivers. The ground forces would then advance along this corridor at maximum speed, crossing the Rhine at Arnhem and driving into the German heartland. If it worked, the war might be over by Christmas. Bletchley was reading German signals that should have raised serious concerns about this plan. Ultra intercepts showed that two SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were in the Arnhem area, refitting after the battering they had taken in Normandy. These were not the broken remnants of the Wehrmacht that Allied commanders had been chasing across France. These were elite armored units in the process of rebuilding their combat power. They were precisely the kind of force that could destroy airborne troops who had no armor and limited anti-tank capability. This intelligence was available. It was passed to the relevant commanders. And the question of what happened to it, why it did not produce the operational caution that should have resulted from it, has been debated by historians for 80 years. The short answer is that the intelligence was discounted by commanders who wanted to believe that the German collapse was more complete than it actually was, and who were pressing the plan forward with momentum that was difficult to break. The longer answer involves command authority, inter-service politics, the pressure to exploit the apparent German weakness before it recovered, and the fundamental difficulty of making careful decisions when all the psychological momentum is pointing toward action. Operation Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. The paratroops of the British 1st Airborne Division dropped at Arnhem and fought one of the most heroic and tragic engagements of the entire war against exactly the panzer units that Ultra had warned about. The corridor was held. The Rhine was not crossed. The Allied advance into Germany was delayed by months. The war did not end in 1944. The intelligence had been there. The warning had been available. And the warning had not produced the right outcome. Because intelligence does not make decisions. People make decisions. Intelligence can improve the quality of those decisions, reduce the uncertainty under which they are made, and sometimes provide specific warnings about specific dangers. But it cannot force commanders to act on what it tells them, and it cannot substitute for the judgment and the will to hear what it is saying, even when it says something that is inconvenient or unwelcome. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the Ultra story, and it is a lesson that applies equally to the AI systems being built today. The best tools in the world do not make good decisions on their own. They enable good decisions by people who are equipped to use them and willing to hear what they are saying. The gap between having the intelligence and acting appropriately on the intelligence is a gap that no technology has yet been able to close, because the gap is not technical. It is human. Turing understood this, I think, at some level. His interest in machine intelligence was not an interest in replacing human judgment. It was an interest in augmenting human capacity, in building tools that could extend what humans could perceive and analyze and understand. The bomb was not a decision maker. It was a perception enhancer, a device that allowed the Bletchley team to see things about the encrypted German communications that would have been invisible without it. The decisions about what to do with what the bomb revealed were still human decisions, made by human beings under conditions of uncertainty and pressure and imperfect knowledge. This distinction between augmenting human capacity and replacing human judgment is one that the AI field is still working out today. The systems that Turing's intellectual legacy has produced are extraordinarily capable at certain kinds of tasks that involve processing large amount of information and identifying patterns and generating outputs that are relevant to the questions being asked. They are not, in any currently operational form, capable of the kind of contextual, ethical, situationally aware judgment that good decision-making requires. They are perception enhancers, analysis augmenters, tools of remarkable capability that are most useful when paired with the human judgment that their designers have always intended them to support. Whether they will remain tools or whether they will eventually become something more than tools, something that has its own judgment and its own values and its own understanding of what it is doing and why, is precisely the question that Turing posed in 1950, and that remains, in the most exact and pressing sense, open. We are closer to that question than we have ever been. We are closer to it because of everything that Turing built and everything that has been built on what he built, and we still do not know the answer. He would have found that fascinating. He would have found it exactly the kind of problem worth spending a life on, hard enough to be genuinely difficult, important enough to matter, open enough to still be alive. The kind of problem that rewards the kind of mind that does not need quick answers and does not flinch from deep uncertainty. The kind of problem that rewards the kind of patience and precision and intellectual courage that Alan Turing had in such extraordinary abundance. He is gone. The problem remains. And the world that is working on it is still, in the deepest sense, the world he made. He was 41 years old. On the bedside table was a half-eaten apple. The post-mortem determined that he had died from cyanide poisoning. The coroner returned a verdict of suicide. His mother, Sarah Turing, refused to accept his verdict. She insisted for the rest of her life that her son had died accidentally, that he had been conducting chemical experiments at home, as he sometimes did, and that cyanide fumes from those experiments had killed him. She pointed to the fact that no suicide note was found, that Turing had recently returned from a holiday and seemed in good spirits, that he had an appointment the following week. She was not simply in denial, though grief and denial are entirely understandable responses. She had reasons to question the official account, and she held her questioning with a mother's conviction that outlasted her own life. We do not know what was in Alan Turing's mind in the final days of his life. We know he was still working. We know his papers and correspondence show active engagement with mathematical problems in the weeks before his death. We know that some of his friends believed he had found a kind of equilibrium after the worst period following his conviction, that he had begun to see more like himself again. We know that the snow-white imagery, the apple and the poison, the fairy tale of a sleeping prince awaiting a kiss that would wake him, has proved irresistible to people who have written about his death, whether or not the symbolism was conscious or deliberate. We know that he was 41 years old, that he had been chemically altered and legally humiliated and professionally curtailed, and that the country whose survival he had helped ensure had done these things to him, while he could not say in public what he had done for it. Whether he chose to die, Whether death came for him accidentally, whether it came in some more complicated form than either of those possibilities suggests we cannot know. What we know is that he was gone, and that the loss was an almost incomprehensible one. For the next 20 years, almost nothing was said. The Official Secrets Act held. The thousands of people who had worked at Bletchley Park went back to their lives. Teachers went back to teaching. Civil servants went back to their departments. Crossword champions went back to their puzzles. The intelligence they had generated, the ships it had saved, the landings it had shaped, the lives it preserved, remained invisible behind the official silence. Books about the war were written without this knowledge. Documentaries were made. Veterans were interviewed. Military historians constructed elaborate explanations for Allied successes that were, in many cases, substantially incomplete because they were missing the single most important explanatory variable. The official silence had practical reasons beyond simple bureaucratic conservatism. The code-breaking methods developed at Bletchley were still being used. GCHQ was still employing techniques derived from the wartime operation. Enigma machines, captured from the Germans, had been given to Commonwealth and Allied nations who were now using them for their own diplomatic and military communications. Communications that Western intelligence services were reading, revealing that Enigma had been broken might compromise those ongoing operations. The silence was maintained for reasons of continuing national interest, even as the men and women who produced the original achievement grew older without acknowledgement. It was not until 1970 that Frederick Winterbotham, a former RAF officer and intelligence official, published the Ultra Secret, the first public account of the Enigma operation and its impact on the war. The book was a sensation. Military historians reading it felt, as one later described it, like watching a film they had seen before and suddenly noticing that an entire set of characters had been invisible. Why had Rommel been so consistently short of supplies in North Africa? Ultra, why had convoy losses dropped so dramatically after certain periods? Ultra, why had D-Day succeeded in its initial critical phase? Ultra, the book did not provide a complete account, and it made some errors that later scholarship corrected, but opened the door that had been closed for 30 years. In the years that followed, the full story began to emerge. F.H. Hensley's multi-volume Official History, British Intelligence in the Second World War, provided the scholarly foundation. Marian Rejewski and his colleagues finally received proper recognition for the Polish contribution. The story of the double agent network and Operation Fortitude was declassified and told. The individual contributions of the remarkable people who had worked at Bletchley, Turing, Welchman, Alexander, Tute, Knox, and hundreds of others began to be documented and understood. And the British public, encountering all of this for the first time, made a discovery that was both exhilarating and deeply uncomfortable. The man who had been at the center of this extraordinary achievement, the man whose theoretical work had made it possible and whose operational contributions had made it real, had been prosecuted by the government he had served, stripped of his security clearance, subjected to chemical treatment that altered his body, and had died at 41. The country that had known none of this while it was happening, that had watched the brief news reporter's conviction without understanding what it was watching, now had to confront what it had done. The response was complicated. As the British response to uncomfortable historical truths often is, there was genuine admiration. There was recognition, growing over decades, of the scale of what Turing had achieved. The Turing Award, which the Association for Computing Machinery had created in 1966 as the highest honor in computer science, had been named for him even before the Bletchley story became public, a reflection of how fundamental his contribution to the field was even in the absence of his wartime work. The award is still given annually and is still considered the Nobel Prize of Computing, a campaign for a formal government apology built over many years. In 2009, the year that would have been Turing's 97th birthday, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a statement on behalf of the British government that was direct and unequivocal. It acknowledged that Turing had been treated appallingly and expressed genuine sorrow for what had been done. It was a real apology, but it came 55 years after his death. It came after the people who had made the decisions that destroyed him were long gone, and after the institutions that had implemented those decisions had been reformed in ways that made them, ostensibly, different institutions from the ones that had prosecuted him. A royal pardon followed in 2013, granted by Queen Elizabeth II. The pardon was welcomed by many, but also prompted debate among legal scholars, historians, and gay rights advocates. A pardon, in its legal form, is an act of mercy extended to someone who has been convicted of a crime. It is not the same as an acknowledgement that the crime itself was never a crime, that the law was unjust, that the conviction should never have occurred. Some argued that what Turing deserved was not a pardon, but a recognition that the law under which he was prosecuted was wrong, and that all the men convicted under it deserved the same recognition. The Turing Law of 2017 came closer to this. The law provided posthumous pardon for all men convicted under the historical laws criminalizing homosexuality, and also create a mechanism for living men with such convictions on their records to have them formally disregarded. It covered an estimated 50,000 men in England and Wales, most of them without public names, their lives disrupted in private ways that no law could undo, their experiences invisible except in aggregate statistics. Turing became the symbolic face of this reckoning not because his case was different in kind from theirs, but because the contrast in his case was so stark, so difficult to look at directly, that it served as a lens through which the injustice of the whole could be seen. In 2021, Alan Turing's face appeared on the Bank of England's £50 note, the most senior denomination of British currency, a note that would circulate through cash registers and wallets and bank vaults for years. The choice of imagery and quotation was deliberate and thoughtful. The quote selected was from his 1952 paper on morphogenesis. This is only a foretaste of what is to come and only the shadow of what is going to be. A forward-looking statement from the last published paper of his life about what lay ahead, the shadow becoming substance, the foretaste becoming the full thing. It is a powerful image to carry into the world on a banknote. It is also inevitably insufficient. No image on currency, no matter how thoughtfully chosen, can give back the years. It cannot give back the work. It cannot restore what was taken. Let me tell you what was actually taken, not in the abstract, in the concrete, irreplaceable, specific terms of what the world lost when Alan Turing died at 41. He was, at the time of his death, working on what would become the mathematical theory of biological pattern formation. His reaction diffusion model, published in 1952, has proved to be one of the genuinely foundational contributions to developmental biology. Subsequent researchers have spent decades working out the implications of this model, verifying predictions experimentally, extending it to new systems, and connecting it to the molecular mechanisms of gene expression and protein interaction that Turing himself did not know about. The field of mathematical biology that Turing's work helped create has produced insights into embryonic development, species diversity, and disease processes that continue to accumulate. What would Turing have done with this field given another 30 or 40 years? What would he have seen when the structure of DNA was revealed in 1953, the year before he died? How would he have connected the mathematics of pattern formation to the information theoretic framework of genetic coding that he was uniquely positioned to understand? He was, at the time of his death, thinking about artificial intelligence in ways that were 30 years ahead of the field's practical development. His 1950 paper had defined the questions. His unpublished notes and correspondence suggest he was already thinking about specific approaches, about programs that learn from experience, about the relationship between the apparent intelligence of programs and the quality of their programming, about what it would mean to simulate the development of a child's mind rather than trying to directly program an adult-level intelligence. These ideas are recognizable today. They are the ideas that underlie modern machine learning approaches, that underlie the large language models that billions of people are now using. Turing was sketching the outline of this intellectual landscape in the early 1950s. What would he have built if he had lived? He was, at the time of his death, one of the most connected intellectual figures in British science. He corresponded with and influenced researchers in computing, mathematics, biology, and philosophy. He was a node in the network of ideas that was building the digital age. The students he would have trained, the papers he would have reviewed, the collaborations he would have initiated, the directions he would have pointed. These are not just personal losses. They are structural losses, gaps in the network of influence and inspiration that cannot be filled retrospectively. Einstein lived to 76. Darwin lived to 73. Newton lived to 84. Each of them produced enormous amounts of work in the years that Turing never had. Faraday lived to 75. Feynman lived to 69. The question of what any of these men might have done with the additional decades is in principle unanswerable. But for Turing, who was working across more fields simultaneously and at higher intensity than almost any of them, the question has particular sharpness. He was not winding down. He was not slowing. He was, in every measurable sense, accelerating. The world you live in is built, in ways both direct and indirect, on foundations that Alan Turing laid. The device you're using to watch this, or to listen to this, or to read this, contains a processor that is the physical implementation of a theoretical framework he described at 23. The software it runs is organized according to architectural principles he was among the first to articulate. The artificial intelligence systems that are now reshaping every industry and every field of knowledge are the practical realization of the research program he defined in 1950. The mathematical biology that is beginning to unlock the secrets of development and disease builds on the reaction diffusion models he published in 1952. He did all of this while keeping a secret that would have made him famous if he had been allowed to speak it. He did all of this while being persecuted for a private life that was no one's business but his own. He did all of this without the recognition he deserved, without the security and the platform that recognition would have brought, and under conditions of forced silence about the most important work he had done. There is a memorial statue in Sackville Park in Manchester. It was created by the sculptor Glenn Hughes and unveiled in 2001, 47 years after Turing's death. The figure shows Turing seated, looking forward, holding an apple. The inscription on the plinth reads, "Father of computer science, mathematician, logician, wartime codebreaker, victim of prejudice." Each of those words is accurate. Each of them is insufficient. Together, they gesture at something that language still cannot quite contain. People visit the memorial. They leave apples. On his birthday in June, the flowers and apples pile up around the bronze figure of the young man thinking, and Manchester and Britain and the world try to say what they should have said when he was alive. You cannot give a man back his years. You cannot give him back the work, the conversations, the students, the discoveries. You cannot undo a prosecution or a course of chemical injections or the revocation of a security clearance. You cannot undo the silence that made him invisible to the people who would have celebrated him, or restore the recognition that might have given him something to stand on in the darkest period. What you can do is know. What you can do is take the story in its full dimensions, not just the triumph of the bomb or the elegance of the Turing test, but all of it, the runner in the gas mask and the stuffed bear, the mathematician who was already in the future while everyone around him was still in the present, the code breaker who held the greatest secret of his age and never spoke it, the philosopher who asked the question that defines our technological moment, the biologist who saw patterns in the living world that others would not confirm for decades, the man who was prosecuted for being himself and who died with an apple on his bedside table at 41. Alan Turing saved your life. He saved the lives of millions of people who never knew his name and who, for decades after the war that he helped win, were not allowed to know it. He won the most important battle of that war not with violence or with political power or with wealth, but with the force of a mind that the world has never quite seen before or since. He deserved better. He deserved enormously, incalculably better than what he got. We cannot give it to him now, but we can, at the very minimum, refuse to forget. We can hold his story in our minds not as a piece of historical trivia, not as a biographical curiosity, but as a permanent, active reminder of what happens when society lets its worst instincts override its recognition of its greatest gifts. If this story has moved you, please share it with someone who hasn't heard it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of history that was hidden, buried, or deliberately silenced. Leave a comment below telling me which part of the story hit you hardest, because I read every single one. And the way you engage with these stories is what drives me to keep finding them. The past is full of people who changed everything, and we're given nothing for it. The least we can do is give them our attention and our memory and the determination not to let their stories disappear again.